The vast emptiness of space stretched endlessly in every direction. Stars flickered in the distance like cold, distant watchers, indifferent to the fate of one lone man drifting in the darkness. Darren Cole, a deep space pilot, barely clung to consciousness inside his damaged escape pod. The oxygen levels were dropping, the temperature was falling, and the weak emergency lights flickered like dying fireflies. His ship, the SS Horizon, had been ambushed by space pirates near the Nilos Nebula. They had come out of nowhere, firing plasma rounds that tore through the hull like paper. His crew never stood a chance. Darren barely managed to escape in the pod before the entire ship was engulfed in flames and vanished into the void. Now he was alone. Adrift, dying. His hands trembled as he checked the pod's distress beacon. The signal was weak, barely functional. Even if someone received it, the chances of a rescue were slim. This sector was Zyrethian space, home to a warrior race that did not look kindly upon humans. His breath came out in short gasps. This was it. This was how he was going to die, forgotten in the cold abyss of space. His eyelids grew heavier. His mind drifted between memories and fading reality. Then, a shadow loomed over him. A ship, large, sleek, and shaped like the wings of a predatory bird. It wasn't human. It wasn't pirate. It was Zyrethian. Darren's heart pounded weakly in his chest. Had they come to finish him off? Or would they ignore him and leave him to die? With a loud metallic clank, the pod was pulled in by a tractor beam. The walls vibrated as it was locked into the ship's docking bay. His lungs burned as he tried to stay awake. But the moment the pod's hatch opened and he glimpsed a tall, armored figure stepping toward him, darkness claimed him. Darren woke to the sound of strange, mechanical humming. Bright lights stung his eyes. His body felt restrained, like he was held in place by some unseen force. He groaned, trying to move, but his wrists and ankles were locked in energy cuffs. His heart raced. Where was he? A shadow moved in front of him. He blinked hard, adjusting to the sight. A woman. Not human. She was tall, powerful, and radiated authority. Her silver skin shimmered under the artificial lights. Her long, jet-black hair was braided, resting over one shoulder, and her piercing silver eyes stared at him with cold, calculating interest. Captain Valera Tisava. Her voice was smooth yet commanding as she spoke in her native language before switching to a robotic, translated version of English. Human. Speak. Why are you in my territory? Darren swallowed hard. His body ached. His throat was dry. But one thing was clear. Darren's head throbbed as he tried to sit up, but the energy cuffs around his wrists and ankles kept him in place. The restraints glowed with a faint blue light, holding him firmly against the metal table. His breathing was heavy, his body weak from dehydration. But his mind was sharp. Across the room, the Zyrethian captain stood tall, her silver eyes cold and unreadable. Captain Valera Tisava did not look pleased. Human, she repeated, her voice smooth but filled with authority. Why were you in my territory? Darren licked his dry lips. I wasn't in your territory on purpose, he said, his voice rough. Pirates attacked my ship. I barely escaped with my life. Valera narrowed her eyes. Pirates. She stepped closer, studying him like he was an insect under a magnifying glass. You expect me to believe that? Darren sighed. He wasn't in the mood for this. He had almost died out there. And now he was being treated like a criminal. Believe whatever you want, he muttered. But check my pod's logs. You'll see the attack was real. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, her gaze like ice. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she gestured to one of the Zyrethian officers standing in the shadows. The officer, a tall male with dark armor, pressed a glowing panel on the wall. A holographic screen appeared, showing Darren's escape pod footage. It clearly captured the pirates ambushing his ship, the destruction of the SS Horizon, and his desperate attempt to escape. Valera's expression didn't change, but Darren could tell she had seen enough. "You are lucky," she said at last. "If I had thought you were a spy, I would have spaced you the moment we pulled you in." Darren shivered. He could tell she meant it. "So, what now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the situation. "You gonna throw me out into space anyway?" Valera folded her arms. "You are a problem. I did not plan to rescue a human today. My crew does not trust your kind. Keeping you here puts us all at risk." Darren exhaled slowly. He knew how alien politics worked. To them, he was an outsider, a potential threat. They had no reason to keep him alive. But then he saw something in her eyes. Hesitation. She hadn't killed him yet. That meant a part of her was considering another option. "Let me prove I'm useful," he said suddenly. Valera raised an eyebrow. "Useful? I'm a pilot. An engineer. I can fix things. Let me help your ship." The Xyrithian captain studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she smirked. "Very well, human," she said. "Let's see if you are worth keeping alive." Darren stood in the middle of the Xyrithian warship's engineering bay, surrounded by advanced alien technology he had never seen before. The hum of energy cores vibrated through the floor, and strange holographic symbols flickered on control panels. Several Xyrithian crew members watched him with suspicion, their silver eyes cold and calculating. They didn't trust him. He could feel their hostility in the air. Captain Valera T. Sava leaned against a console, arms crossed. She studied him like a scientist observing an experiment. "You claim you are useful, human," she said. "Then prove it." Darren exhaled, his eyes scanning the room. The ship had taken damage. That much was obvious. The energy flow was unstable, and the lighting flickered in some areas. He noticed a power fluctuation in one of the main control panels. "What's wrong with your system?" he asked, stepping forward. One of the Xyrithian engineers sneered. "Nothing a human could understand." Darren smirked. "Let me guess. Your energy cores are overloading because the cooling system isn't distributing power evenly." The crew members stiffened. Valera's silver eyes narrowed slightly. Darren walked up to the control panel, quickly scanning the alien symbols. He didn't know the language, but engineering followed logic. Wires, circuits, and power grids all worked on the same basic principles, no matter the species. "You've got a power loop," Darren said, pointing at a shimmering red symbol. "This system is stuck in a constant feedback loop, making the ship work harder than it should. That's why you're getting unstable energy surges." The Xyrithian engineer scoffed. "That's impossible. Before he could finish, the lights flickered violently. A loud humming noise filled the room. Sparks shot from one of the overhead conduits. "Yeah, real stable," Darren muttered. Valera tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "And you can fix this." Darren cracked his knuckles. "Watch me." He quickly pulled out a small tool from a nearby workstation. The Xyrithian engineers hesitated but let him work. Darren rerouted the energy flow, bypassing the loop and forcing the system to reset. Within moments, the humming stopped, and the lights returned to normal. The room fell silent. The Xyrithian crew exchanged glances, some looking impressed, others irritated. Valera stepped forward. "Interesting," she said, her voice calm but thoughtful. "A human fixing a Xyrithian warship. That is not something I expected to see." Darren wiped his hands on his jumpsuit. "You saved my life, Captain. I don't plan on wasting it." For the first time, Valera's expression softened, just slightly. "Perhaps you are not as useless as I thought," she murmured. Then she turned to her crew. "Release the human's restraints. He stays." Darren grinned. Maybe surviving this ship wouldn't be so impossible after all. The Xyrithian warship sailed through the void, its sleek, predatory form cutting through space like a silent hunter. Darren had started to settle in, earning a cautious truce with the crew. He had proven his worth, fixing power issues and assisting with minor repairs. But the peace didn't last long. Alarms suddenly blared through the ship, red warning lights flashing across every corridor. Darren had been in the engineering bay when the chaos began, but he didn't need a translator to understand what was happening. They were under attack. He ran toward the command bridge, dodging rushing crew members. As soon as he stepped inside, the massive holographic screen at the center of the room displayed the threat: a fleet of enemy ships approaching fast. Dregzar raiders, a Zyrethian officer growled. Darren frowned. He didn't know much about the Dregzar, but from what little he had heard, they were a ruthless race of plunderers and slavers. And now, they were coming straight for them. Captain Valera Tisava stood tall at the front of the bridge, her silver eyes locked on the incoming ships. Her calm, commanding voice cut through the noise. Battle stations. Prepare the weapons. The warship shook violently as the first plasma blasts hit their shields. The force nearly knocked Darren off his feet. He grabbed onto the nearest console. Do your shields always feel this weak? One of the Zyrethian officers snarled at him. They are not weak. The Dregzar are using a disruptor field. Our defenses won't hold for long. Darren's stomach twisted. That wasn't good. Valera turned sharply. Human, if you have another miracle in you, now would be a good time. Darren's mind raced. Disruptor fields worked by interfering with shield generators, making them unstable. That meant he bolted to the nearest control panel and started typing. A Zyrethian technician glared at him. What are you doing? Buying us time, Darren muttered. He redirected power from non-essential systems and focused it into a rotating shield frequency, a trick human ships use to counter disruptors. The moment he hit execute, the warship's shields flared brightly, then stabilized. The next enemy blast hit, but instead of shaking the ship, it barely made an impact. The Zyrethian crew stared in disbelief. The shields are holding, one officer shouted. Valera turned to Darren, her silver eyes flashing with something close to approval. Impressive, human, she said. Now let's end this fight. With the shields stable, Valera commanded her gunners to fire back at full power. Bright blue plasma beams erupted from the warship, striking the enemy fleet with deadly precision. One by one, the Dregzar ships exploded, forced to retreat. As the battle ended, the bridge fell silent. Darren exhaled. His heart was still pounding, but he had done it. He had saved them. Valera smirked. You continue to surprise me, human. Darren grinned. Get used to it, Captain. The warship floated in the quiet of space, the battle now over. The Dregzar raiders had been forced to retreat, and the ship's systems were slowly returning to normal. Darren leaned against a console in the command bridge, his body aching from the stress of the fight. His fingers still tingled from working the controls, and his heart was finally starting to slow down. The Zyrethian crew moved about, tending to damage reports and power readings. Many still eyed him with suspicion, but this time there was something else in their gazes: respect. Captain Valera Tisava stood at the center of the bridge, her silver eyes scanning the holographic display of the battlefield. Her expression was unreadable, as always. Finally, she turned toward him. You saved this ship, human. Darren smirked, crossing his arms. That's twice now. You're welcome. A few of the Zyrethian officers muttered in irritation, but Valera simply tilted her head. Perhaps I was wrong about you. Darren raised an eyebrow. Oh, and what did you think of me before? Valera stepped closer, her silver gaze locked onto his. Weak, reckless, a liability. Darren chuckled. Ouch, and now? She paused for a moment before answering. Useful. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but coming from a Zyrethian warrior, Darren figured it was the best he was going to get. Still, there was something different in the way Valera looked at him now. She wasn't just studying him as an outsider. She was considering him as part of her crew. Before he could say anything else, a new alarm chimed through the bridge. A Zyrethian officer quickly checked the control panel. Captain, incoming transmission from High Command. Valera's expression hardened. She gave Darren one last glance before turning away. Patch it through. A holographic screen appeared, and an older Xyrithian warrior came into view. His armor was dark and decorated with medals, his sharp features making it clear he was someone important. "Captain Tisa'a, explain yourself," the voice boomed. Darren could tell this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. The officer continued, his tone cold. "We have received reports that you harbor a human aboard your warship. Is this true?" Valera did not hesitate. "Yes." A murmur of disapproval came from the transmission. "Then you have made a dangerous mistake. Humans are not to be trusted. You will hand him over immediately." Darren's stomach dropped. He had just earned his place here, and now they wanted to throw him away. Valera stood tall, her jaw tightening. She glanced at Darren briefly before turning back to the transmission. "No." Silence filled the bridge. Darren blinked. Had she just defied her own command? The officer's voice grew sharp. "Captain, do not disobey your orders." Valera's eyes flashed with defiance. "He stays with me." Darren had no idea why she was protecting him. But one thing was clear. His fate was now tied to hers. The bridge remained silent after Captain Valera Tisava's bold declaration. The Xyrithian High Command officer on the holographic screen stared at her in disbelief. "You defy direct orders, Captain." His voice was sharp, filled with warning. "You risk your position, your crew, and your honor for a human." Valera's expression remained unreadable, but Darren could see the tension in her jaw. She wasn't just standing up for him. She was making a choice that could cost her everything. "He is useful," she said, her voice calm but firm. "This ship would be floating debris without his intervention." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You believe one human is worth the trust of your own kind." Valera did not answer immediately. Darren held his breath, unsure of what she would say next. Finally, the officer exhaled in frustration. "Very well, Captain. You wish to keep your pet, then prove his worth in a real test." A second later, coordinates flashed on the bridge's main screen. "This is a neutral outpost under our control," the officer continued. "A shipment of high-energy cores has gone missing. We suspect smugglers or outside interference. If your human is as resourceful as you claim, he will retrieve the stolen goods." Darren frowned. That sounded like a trap. "If he succeeds," the officer added, "he may stay under your command. If he fails, you will hand him over. No further discussion." The transmission ended abruptly. The hologram flickered out, leaving the bridge in silence. Darren turned to Valera. "So, what now, Captain?" She exhaled slowly before facing him. "Now we see if you can survive outside this ship." Hours later, Darren found himself aboard a small Xyrithian scout vessel, heading toward the neutral outpost. Valera was with him, along with two of her best soldiers. "You trust this high command deal?" Darren asked as he checked the ship's systems. Valera's silver eyes flickered with irritation. "No, but it is the only way to secure your place here." Darren smirked. "Didn't know you cared so much." She shot him a sharp look. "I don't, but I refuse to let outsiders make my decisions for me." Darren chuckled but said nothing more. As they approached the outpost, the scanners picked up unusual activity. Ships were docked at strange angles, and security patrols were absent. Valera frowned. "Something is wrong." Darren felt a pit form in his stomach. "Yeah, this isn't a simple smuggling job, is it?" Before Valera could respond, a distress signal crackled through the ship's speakers. "Unidentified vessel. This is Outpost Epsilon 7. We are under attack." The transmission cut off with a loud explosion. Valera's grip tightened on the controls. Darren sighed. Of course, it couldn't be easy. The ship descended into chaos, and Darren realized this was more than a mission. This was a trap. Darren tightened his grip on the seat as the Xyrithian scout ship descended toward Outpost Epsilon 7. Fires raged across the station's docking bay, and damaged ships floated lifelessly in the low orbit above it. "This is a war zone," Darren muttered. "Not a smuggling problem." Valera's silver eyes darkened. Agreed. This was a setup. She maneuvered the ship carefully, dodging falling debris. The moment they landed, the bay doors hissed open, and her two elite soldiers stepped out first, weapons raised. Darren followed, heart pounding. The air inside the outpost was thick with smoke and the scent of burning metal. The corridors were littered with fallen guards, some still clutching their weapons. It was clear they had been ambushed. A weak voice crackled through their comms. This is Lieutenant Raylis. If anyone is receiving this, they betrayed us. The shipment. The transmission cut out. Darren exchanged a look with Valera. Who betrayed them? Before she could answer, heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway. A squad of armored mercenaries appeared, their weapons trained on them. The leader, a tall, scared alien with reptilian features, grinned. Ah, Captain Tisava, you're late. Valera's hand went to her plasma blade, her stance deadly. You were expecting me. The mercenary smirked. Not you, just the human. Darren's stomach dropped. Valera's soldiers immediately raised their weapons, but the mercenaries were faster. Gunfire erupted, forcing them to take cover behind a damaged cargo container. This was never about the stolen shipment. Darren shouted over the chaos. They lured us here for me. Valera gritted her teeth as she deflected a plasma shot with her blade. High Command set this up. They wanted you captured or killed. Darren's breath came short. The Zyrethian government had betrayed them. Then what's the plan? He asked, dodging a shot. Valera smirked despite the danger. We fight. With a quick motion, she threw a small pulse grenade into the mercenary squad. It exploded with a shockwave, sending enemies flying. Darren didn't hesitate. He grabbed a fallen mercenary's weapon and fired back. For once, he wasn't just surviving, he was fighting. The battle was short but brutal. Valera and her soldiers cut through the enemy ranks with deadly precision, and Darren took down a few himself. Minutes later, the last mercenary collapsed. The outpost was silent again. Darren wiped sweat from his forehead. That was too close. Valera exhaled, stepping toward him. For the first time, she looked at him with something deeper than respect. They wanted you gone, she said. I won't let that happen. Darren nodded, his trust in her now unshakable. But he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't return to Zyrethian space. They were fugitives now. The Zyrethian scout ship blasted off from Outpost Epsilon 7, leaving the station in ruins behind them. The stars stretched ahead like a cold, endless sea. The ship's engines hummed steadily. But inside, there was an uneasy silence. Darren stood at the small viewport, staring out at the dark expanse of space. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were now on the run. High Command had tried to kill him, and they were likely still hunting for him. Behind him, Valera Tiasava paced, her silver eyes narrowed in thought. The battle had been swift, but the consequences were far from over. We've just become fugitives, Darren said quietly, turning away from the viewport. They'll send everything after us. Zyrethian or not, we won't be safe. Valera stopped pacing and met his gaze. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she spoke with the same calm, yet determined tone she always had. They won't catch us. Darren raised an eyebrow. You're confident. I've been through worse, she replied. I've outwitted the best. And now, we have each other. He nodded slowly. That much was true. He had never expected to survive this long, but somehow he was still alive. And Valera, despite her rigid command and her people's distrust, had become someone he could count on. Suddenly, the ship's console beeped, and a message flashed on the main screen. It was a warning signal. A fleet of Zyrethian warships was closing in on their location. Darren's stomach tightened. He knew that this was it. High Command had found them. We need to jump, Valera said, her voice calm but urgent. Jump? Darren asked, looking at her in confusion. "To the Veil Rift," she explained, typing commands into the console. "It's an uncharted space, a region where ships are often lost. If we go there, we might be able to lose them." Darren's heart skipped a beat. The Veil Rift was known to be dangerous, full of unpredictable gravity fields, strange energy waves, and navigational hazards. Many ships had entered, but only a few had made it out. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Valera met his gaze with a calm intensity. "It's our only chance." Darren exhaled, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. There was no turning back. He nodded. "Then let's do it." The engines roared to life as Valera initiated the jump. The ship shuddered, and the stars outside the viewport began to warp and twist, like ribbons of light being pulled into a whirlpool. The Veil Rift loomed ahead, a swirling mass of dark clouds and flashes of lightning. "Hold on," Valera said. Darren gripped the nearest seat as the ship shot forward. The gravitational pull was immediate. He felt his stomach drop as the ship was pulled into the rift. Space itself seemed to bend and twist around them, and the lights inside flickered wildly. For what felt like hours, the ship tumbled through the chaotic energy of the rift. Darren had no idea where they were heading or how Valera was keeping the ship intact. But he had no choice but to trust her. Finally, the ship began to slow, and the chaos outside seemed to quiet. The stars straightened themselves out, and the rift's strange disturbances faded into the background. Valera exhaled. "We're through." Darren wiped his forehead, still shaking from the experience. That was insane. Valera gave him a rare small smile. "It's the only way we stay alive." They were lost in the unknown, but for the first time, Darren felt like he was in the right place, with Valera, and with no one else to answer to. Together, they would face whatever came next. The Zarethian scout ship drifted quietly through the Veil Rift, its engines humming steadily. The stars outside the viewport looked strangely different here, their light distorted by the dense energy fields of the rift. It was a place few dared to go, a place of mystery and danger. But for Darren and Captain Valera Tassava, it was a sanctuary. They had spent the past few days in relative silence, navigating through the rift's turbulent space. The ship's systems were holding up, but the constant turbulence made it difficult to think about anything but survival. Darren sat at a small table in the ship's mess, staring at the holographic map of the rift. He had no idea where they were headed or how long they could stay hidden in this dangerous void, but it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the ship, and the woman at the helm. Valera had been quieter than usual. She spent most of her time on the bridge, monitoring the ship's systems and keeping an eye on their surroundings. Every now and then, Darren would catch a glimpse of her through the doorway, her figure illuminated by the cold light of the control panels. One evening, as the soft hum of the ship filled the room, Valera finally came to join him. She looked weary but determined, her eyes still sharp despite the exhaustion. "You haven't rested properly in days," Darren said, looking up from the table. "You need to sleep." She tilted her head, the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. "I don't need sleep. But you do." Darren chuckled. "Well, I'm not a Zarethian, so maybe I do." He stretched, feeling the weight of the last few days settle into his bones. "I'm not used to being on the run like this. It's all a little surreal." Valera took a seat across from him, her expression serious. "I've been on the run before. This isn't new to me." Darren raised an eyebrow. "You've been on the run." Valera nodded, her eyes darkening slightly. "I'm not the perfect Zarethian soldier everyone believes I am. I've made mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes have consequences." She paused, her gaze shifting to the stars outside. "But those mistakes have brought me here, with you." Darren's heart skipped a beat. Her voice wasn't cold. It was soft, almost vulnerable. She had never shared this side of herself with him before. "I know you don't trust me completely," she continued, "and I don't expect you to. But I do trust you, Darren." She looked at him directly, her eyes unwavering. I didn't have to save you. I could have left you to die in the nebula. But I chose to keep you with me." Darren felt a strange warmth spread through him. He had been on his own for so long, and now he found himself with someone who was willing to fight for him, to stand by his side no matter the danger. "I don't know why you're doing this," he said quietly, "but I'm glad you are." Valera leaned back in her chair, the faintest smile on her lips. "Maybe it's because you're the only one I can trust now, after everything that's happened, after High Command turned their back on us. You're all I have left." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but understanding. Darren realized that, despite everything, they were no longer just survivors. They were partners, in every sense of the word. Valera stood up and walked toward the bridge without a word, but Darren's thoughts followed her. He had never expected his life to take such a turn. He was no longer a simple pilot or engineer. He was part of something much bigger now. As the ship sailed deeper into the rift, Darren made a silent promise to himself. No matter what came next, he would stand by her side. Always. The Veil Rift had become a place of strange peace for Darren and Captain Valera Tusava. The stars around them were unlike anything Darren had seen before, blurry, flickering, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. The ship's engines hummed steadily, and though they were still on the run, there was an odd sense of calm that seemed to settle over both of them. Darren stood by the viewport, watching the twisting colors of the rift swirl and shift as the ship glided silently through space. He had never been more aware of how isolated they were, but for the first time, he didn't feel lonely. Valera had become his anchor in this unknown part of the galaxy. Her strength, her confidence, her quiet resilience. She had saved him more times than he could count, and each time, he had come to trust her more. He could hear her voice coming from the bridge, calm and commanding as always. She had resumed her post after a short rest, already making plans for the next move. Despite everything, Valera was never idle. She was always thinking, always moving forward, even when the road ahead was uncertain. Darren felt a sense of gratitude wash over him, but also something else, something stronger. He had never imagined that his Erethian warrior would be the one to pull him from the edge of death, not once, but over and over again. And now she was his only ally in a vast universe that had rejected them both. He turned toward the bridge and walked slowly toward her. "Captain," he called softly as he entered the room. Valera didn't look up immediately. She was focused on the star maps, plotting a course through the rift. But when she finally met his gaze, there was a softness there, a rare vulnerability she usually kept hidden beneath her armor. "Darren," she acknowledged, her voice steady. "We're making good progress. If we can navigate through the core of the rift, we'll have a chance to reach a safe zone." Darren nodded, but his heart was on something else. "Valera," he began, taking a step closer. "We've been through so much together. I know we're not out of danger yet, but—" He paused, finding it harder to say than he thought. "I want you to know, no matter what happens, I'm with you, always." Her eyes flickered with something Darren couldn't quite name. She didn't say anything at first, but there was a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I've never had anyone say that to me before," she said quietly. "Not in all my years, but I believe you." Darren felt his heart beat a little faster. He had thought about this moment countless times, but now that it was here, it felt more real than anything he had ever known. She stepped forward, her presence so commanding yet so gentle in the same breath. Her silver eyes locked with his, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped. "I made a choice when I saved you," she said, her voice low and sincere. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. You are worth fighting for." Darren's chest tightened. He couldn't help but feel that this was it, that in this one fleeting moment, they had found something worth protecting. He reached out, and without another word, they came together, the weight of their shared struggles finally settling in between them. The ship continued to sail through the rift, but for Darren and Valera, the journey had already begun. Together,